Good evening and welcome. My name is Alexandra Brown, and I'm the Special Projects Coordinator of Alumni Engagement at Rutgers University, Newark. Thank you all for joining us today for the Run 75 Author Talk series, which is a part of a year-long celebration of Rutgers University Newark's 75th anniversary. Tonight's Author Talk features Bill McCarthy, who is the Dean of the School of Criminal Justice at Rutgers Newark. Dean McCarthy will discuss his recently published book, Chicago's Reckoning, Racism, Politics, and the Deep History of Policing in an American City, co-authored with John Hagan and Daniel Herda. The discussion will be moderated by alumna Dr. Yesenia Pizarro. Dean McCarthy joined Rutgers University Newark in 2020. His early research focused on adolescent offending and relationships with parents, fictive family, peers, and romantic partners. In these studies, he and his co-authors developed ideas about criminal capital, co-offending, illegal success, and danger. Some of his more recent research examines overt discrimination and juvenile crime, while other projects use a labor perspective to examine sex work. His awards include the 2020 American Society of Criminology Mentor Award, the 2020 University of California Davis Graduate and Postdoctoral Mentorship Award, the 2010 American Society of Criminology Outstanding Paper Award, the 1998 American Society of Criminology Michael J. Hindelang Outstanding Book on Crime Award, and the 1997 Society for Study of Social Problems C. Wright Mills Outstanding Book on Social Problems Award. Our moderator, Dr. Yesenia Pizarro, is an associate professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University. Her research focuses on the importance of understanding the proximal event and situational factors that result in violence. Dr. Pizarro is currently a member of the Firearm Safety Among Children and Teens Consortium and the Homicide Research Working Group. In various capacities and roles, she has worked with police departments and agencies throughout the country in joint efforts to curb violence and has managed federally funded grants that focus on urban violence and intimate partner homicide prevention, which were awarded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, National Institute of Health, and the Center for Disease Control. She's the editor-in-chief of Homicide Studies, an interdisciplinary and international journal. Dr. Pizarro is a proud Newark native and three-time Rutgers University alumna. Now, before we begin, please note that all attendees have been placed on mute for the duration of this discussion. If you have questions, please send them via the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. It is now my privilege to turn it over to Dean McCarthy and Dr. Pizarro.
Thank you, Alexandra.
Yes, thank you, Alexandra, for such a wonderful welcome and introduction. And thank you for also inviting me to be part of this event. And it's really nice to be here via Zoom from Arizona. I always tell people no matter where I go or what I do, I'm always going to be a Jersey girl and I'm always going to be a Scarlet Knight. So I'm really happy and honored to be here. Dean McCarthy, this is our first time meeting each other. So thank you for having me. And it's also a pleasure to meet you and to have read your book and to be here to moderate this discussion.
Thank you, Yesenia. It's a pleasure to meet you. And thank you for agreeing to come and help us out with this. We really appreciate it. It's wonderful to have alums engaged with the school, and you've been wonderful at that. And I want to welcome everyone who could make it tonight. It's nice to see, although I can't actually see everyone out there. It's nice to know that people are interested and could make some time to come and hear what we have to say.
Well, let's get to it. My questions are not too hard. So
nice that you're kind.
So we are going to be discussing your book, Chicago Reckoning, Racism, Politics, and the Deep History of Policing in an American City. So the title of your book puts several topics front and center. Let's start with Chicago. Why Chicago?
Well, there's a number of reasons, and so I don't know if I'll make it through them all. But first, Chicago is the site where this the torture scandal that is at the center of the book took place. Over approximately 2 decades, from the 1970s and 1990s, a group of Chicago police officers systematically tortured upwards of 100 to 130, we don't know the exact number, of suspects. And so that's sort of how one of this initiatives for the project was to try to locate that torture in a broader narrative. A number of people have written about the torture, and there's a number of good books on it that have been published over the last few years. And we wanted to draw on those materials, but to think about it in ways that other people have not. I think the second thing is that much of the book focuses on the role of race, and Chicago was one of the sites of the Great Migration northward. And like many other cities in the North, it experienced a tremendous influx of African Americans leaving the South. And we often forget that conditions in the North, although different from conditions in the South, were not great. There's lots of mistreatment of African Americans coming into Chicago and other cities in the North, whether we see the behavior of particular individuals who used violence. There's bombings, assaults, violence directed against individuals and individual families, but there's a lot of systematic racism that occurred in that period. Richard Rothstein's very detailed but depressing book, The Color of Law, for example, gives a long litany of the things that institutions did, churches, universities, residential community groups, to segregate African Americans, to residential covenances, redlining, and other practices to make it so that African Americans were forced into certain neighborhoods that were often under-resourced. And so that's an important part of the story that we tell. And Chicago, like some of the other northern cities, was and still is in many ways a hyper-segregated city with very high concentrations of African Americans in neighborhoods that are underserved and under-resourced. Another, I think, factor was that there's a long history of difficult relationships between police and African American residents in African American neighborhoods in Chicago. Let's go back to the early 20th century where there were race riots or at least influenced by interactions between residents and the police. Up through the 20th century, we have in recent history, interactions between the police and African American residents and community and neighborhoods that have been problematic. Another thing that we can't ignore is that it's the availability of data. Social scientists struggle with trying to get data, and the city of Chicago has provided much of the data that we used, often because of court orders and through the very hard work of activists and lawyers and independent citizens who pushed to make data publicly available for social scientists. The Invisible Institute, for example, in Chicago, made available the data that we use on complaints against police. We were able to get City of Chicago police data in terms of stops and arrests. And so without those data, it would have been impossible for us to do the research. The Invisible Institute, for example, also made publicly available all the data on the torture cases that we at the center of the book. And I would be remiss if I didn't, at least as a sociologist, point to the role of the Chicago School of Sociology. And it has a very long history, starting in the early 20th century. And two of the theorists who worked at Chicago at that time, Clifford Shawn and Henry McKay, emphasized that if you want to understand social phenomena, you need centered place as a way of making sense of things. And they really introduced neighborhood studies to the study of crime and delinquency. And ours research is a neighborhood research. We do have some data on individuals. We, for example, talk about an individual case of a murder in Chicago, and we talk about the individual torture cases. But our way of thinking about it is how neighborhood variation is related to a lot of the outcomes that we study. I'll stop.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I want to get back to that neighborhood aspect. But before we get there, I want to stay within the theme of the title of the book. And you mentioned race relations and the Great Migration. So racism plays an important role in your title. We know structural racism, critical race theory, and related topics have drawn a lot of attention in the past 2 years. What aspects of racism does your book examine?
So that's a complicated question, and it is, as you say, very topical right now because of much of the hand-wringing about critical race theory and its role. And we draw on critical race theory to make sense of some of the things that we study. But I guess some of the early research that I had done looked at individual discrimination in the United States, using data on African-American adolescents and exploring the extent to which they had experienced racial discrimination. And that's part of the story. We have individual police officers using torture systematically against predominantly minority men in Chicago in this period. It would be hard not to think that some racism is some level is involved in this, that to torture people, it requires a certain separation of you and them as victims and seeing them as somehow deserving of horrific treatment, which typically some element of race or some race or ethnic discrimination is involved so that separation occurs. And the torture that we describe was systematically covered up for years, even though one of the researchers, Lawrence Ralph, an anthropologist who studied in Chicago, talks about it as being an open secret. People knew about it, but there was no consistent investigation into it. And it's hard not to think that individuals involved in that cover-up did not think of the African-American, predominantly men who were mistreated and tortured, were somehow not deserving of treatment. And racism may be involved in that. But that's not our focus so much. Our focus more is the structural conditions that led to hyper-segregation in Chicago, and what are the implications of that? One of the things that we know, for example, in the United States is that African Americans, relative to whites and Asians and Hispanics, have more mistrust in the police as an institution. They have less faith in police, and they're are more likely to think that the police will not be able to help them. The sociologists Robert Sampson and Don Bartouche talk about this as legal cynicism. Monica Bell talks about it as legal estrangement, the notion that people have less faith in police, the police who police their neighborhoods and those individual officers, but also the police as an institution. And what we see is that is associated with racial segregation, that the more communities are racially segregated, the more African Americans are isolated, and the type of treatment that occurs in those neighborhoods in terms of policing is associated with that legal cynicism. And some people have argued that legal cynicism is essentially a deficit, that it damages communities, it discourages them from being engaged in the police, to reaching out to the police, and doing what social legal theorist Donald Black calls engaging in self-help to solve problems, essentially using violence to deal with crime. And we do talk about a case of that. We talk about the case of a young man, Joseph White, who ends up shooting and killing one of his schoolmates. And there's clear evidence that he uses self-help because he feels desperate in terms of not being able to get protection from police and other institutions that may have had a different outcome had they been more involved in that life. And that's a case in which the minimal resources available in a community, a segregated community, might have influenced his actions. But our interest is more, do we see evidence that neighborhoods that are racially segregated aren't engaging with the police? And we find the opposite. We find that independent of how much crime there is in neighborhoods, the economic conditions of the neighborhood, communities that are highly densely populated with African Americans do call the police. They are asking for help, but they're not asking for help to fix broken windows or to do stop and frisk. They're asking for help to help them with crime. And a couple of social legal theorists had talked in, I'm going to draw a blank on their names, in a New York Times editorial, a while ago, talking about how when politicians hear distressed neighborhoods call for something be done to address policing, they often hear more policing. And what our research suggests is that actually, no, it's better policing. And that's what we want, that the communities want. Yes, they're mistrustful of the police, they're suspicious of them, they're not confident that they'll get services, but yet survey research tells us that African Americans, like whites and Asians and Hispanics, think that that's who they'll call when they're in trouble. And we see evidence of that. And that in these racially segregated communities, they're calling the police for help. Our research also shows, though, that these communities are also complaining about the police when they misbehave. And I think that's very encouraging. It's consistent with Black Lives Matter and other civil rights movements and activities that define much of the United States history since the 1960s, showing that communities will ask for justice. And racially segregated communities who disproportionately bear the brunt of injustice will complain about it. And that's, legal cynicism is not a deficit, it's actually an asset because it pushes them to demand for change.
Yeah, I think that's very timely, and it's very important for the public to understand those aspects that you hit it right in the head when you say it's better policing, right? Like, how can you make the policing better? We know that there's research out there that has shown that police tend to sometimes police differently based on the characteristics of neighborhoods. So how can we make sure that they do a better within some neighborhoods, but also some of the discussion that you just pointed out, it just brought to mind the code of the street and some of Elijah Anderson's work with like how these codes emerge as a form of self-help. So even though we're talking about Chicago, we see these parallels in some of the research that has been coming out recently in other cities relating to the self-help behavior, as well as what we know in terms of what police do on their day-to-day and how they respond to crime based on neighborhoods. So I find that very interesting.
I'm just going to add something to see. Jeff Hagan and his team have shown how, and other researchers have done this as well, in terms of ethnographic research and interviews with police about how police construct neighborhood frames, ways of understanding neighborhoods, ways that they make sense of them. And those are often informed by what they believe to be the characteristics of the neighborhood, one of which is how much crime is in it. Yep. And Hagan and colleagues show those are often very poorly constructed narratives. They're often inaccurate. And this is not because the police are not good at figuring things out, it's that they don't often have very good information about what neighborhood conditions and neighborhood variation and things like that. So that's, yeah, you're right, that we need to get better at communicating that research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and hopefully we're moving towards that direction when there's been a call for it, and I'm hopeful. So moving on, because I could keep on talking about what I'm hopeful for. So the murder of George Floyd. It's hard to talk about policing and racism and neighborhoods without addressing this. So the murder of George Floyd and the excessive and often fatal use of force by police is something that concerns us all, and it has been getting a lot of attention for the past couple of years. What does your book contribute to that discussion?
So that's a really important question. Our book focuses mostly on torture, which is an excessive use of force, but it's not the fatal use of force. And although the fatal use of force is horrific and something we need to pay attention to, we can't ignore other types of misbehavior by police. And torture is just one step back from fatal violence, but there are other types of mistreatment. And the research on complaints, we find that the most common complaints is that people are just treated badly, and that police can do so much better in terms of when they interact with folks about how to treat them in better ways. But I think one of the things that the George Floyd case had led to was a conversation about the acts of individuals. And it's hard not to focus on that when you see the horrific things that we saw in the George Floyd case, but also in other cases where individual officers clearly behave in egregious ways. The book ends with the discussion of the Laquan McDonald murder, for example, by a Chicago police officer. And the individuals who participated in the torture that is at the center of the book were clearly individual officers operating and making decisions about how to treat suspects. But it's easy when we're thinking about those individual decisions to do that, to forget that these individuals are located in groups of other individuals who are either not commenting on, ignoring, silently watching, but also making decisions not to reveal or draw attention to the misbehavior of others. And that's understandable. We can think of many occupations where alerting others about the misbehavior of your colleagues is fraught with anxiety and potential threats to your career. But it is what we need to do, and we expect it in the academy, and when we need to expect it of other occupations, that it is our responsibility, if we believe strongly in what we do as a profession, to protect that profession from the misbehavior of our fellow, whatever it be, fellow officers, fellow academics, fellow teachers. I think another thing that the conversation around George Floyd is that it's focused a lot on the police and forgetting that the police are an organization which is strongly influenced, especially in some places, by municipal governments, by state governments. One of the things that our book draws attention to is what Lawrence Ralph, the anthropologist I referred to earlier, talks about, is that this was an open secret in Chicago, that the torture went on. And it's clear that many bureaucrats and politicians knew about it and did not do anything about it. And we have police chiefs up to politicians. They help define what will happen in police organizations. And as you know, in terms of how police act in doing their jobs. And so they bear some responsibility. And in this case, for the cover-up of a torture that went on for many years and affected many people. But in other situations, in the Laquan McDonald case, for example, covering up the police use of fatal violence and his death. So I think what we're trying to draw attention to is that it's not just individual actors making decisions that we need to focus on. We need to think about where they are located within their organization, how the organization structures itself, the training that it provides, the messages that it communicates, how it sees what its job is in terms of what policing looks like and how it unfolds.
And I like that you bring up this point about the municipal, political structure, because a lot of these, so like you mentioned, you have these individuals, officers, but there's also a broader culture, right? And the broader culture that comes from within the police department and the hierarchy within the department. But that culture also comes from the city government and the municipal government. So switching gears a little bit, yes, what were you going to say before I ask?
I was just going to say, there's a tendency to think that there is a police culture out there. And I think you make the very good point that culture is much more local. And there is, yes, some shared cultural things that are less local, but much of what happens in police departments is much more local. And that's an easy point to overlook.
Yes, and I would plug in maybe your next book could focus on the culture of cities, the cultures that is set forth from the municipal government down, because that really is going to inform a lot of the behaviors that we start seeing within the line officers, right? So we automatically think it's this line officer, but it comes from up down But that's another topic, and that's for your next book, and I expect to be invited for that one. So going back to politics, right, and culture, what's the role of politics in this book narrative?
So, the book spans more than 50 years, and the two politicians who are at the center of it are the two mayors, Richard M. and Richard J. Daley. And part of that is sort of Richard J. Daley setting the context for Chicago in terms of whether it's his involvement in terms of bringing in and creating large public housing developments and segregating African Americans in those neighborhoods, to the conflict with Martin Luther King. King came to Chicago to try to advocate for better housing in the 1960s, and Daley famously undercut that movement by appearing to saying he wanted to help work with King, and then making it impossible for King to make any advancements. Daley set the tone, the senior Daley set the tone in terms of, we think about the police use of force during the 1968 Democratic Convention, the execution of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark of the Black Panther Party. So Richard Daley comes from that background in terms of a politician who's willing to use city development in ways to isolate African Americans and to use the police for a particular agenda. The second person is Richard J. Daley, the son, and he is the state's attorney when a case occurs in the torture scandal, that is the eventual undoing of the torture in terms of making it more public. It's a shooting of two police officers that occur in 1982. And Daley is the state's attorney at that period. And the two officers are shot, and it immediately leads to lots of on-the-ground investigations trying to find out who shot the officers. But it quickly goes badly in terms of police misuse of force, and particularly in African-American communities as they search for suspects. And when the two suspects are eventually arrested, then this torture unfolds. And it seems implausible that Daley would not know about the torture that occurred during these cases, given that he was the state's attorney at the time, and his office was in a constant communication with the mayor of Chicago and the police division where the two men who were arrested were taken. There are two brothers named the Wilson brothers. And then Daley becomes Richard M. Daley becomes the mayor of Chicago in the late 1980s, and is the mayor for a long period in which the torture that occurred is never discussed. There is no investigation for a long time. And then when it finally does start, the stories start to come out, Daley continually denies knowing about what happened. And so there's lots of speculation about his role and the role of other politicians and bureaucrats in stymieing investigations into this and other misconduct by the Chicago police. And Chicago's infamous for having spent almost $1 billion on settlements for police misuse of force, including many of the victims of this torture. And then the book ends with the terrible shooting of Laquan McDonald and Mayor Rahm Emanuel's again trying to cover up the case and withholding evidence and obstructing justice in not refusing to release a video of the shooting. And so we're arguing that it's easy to point the finger at individual police officers who engage in egregious behavior, and then maybe say, well, there's something wrong with the police. But yet, as you had said earlier, municipal politics play a big role in what happens in police departments, and they need to take responsibility.
Yeah, this is fascinating. But one of the things that I thought of is how it's all interrelated, right? And this is thinking of the Chicago school, thinking of social ecology. It's all interrelated. This even as you were talking in the beginning, the decision to segregate individuals in particular areas of the city, it just shows, I think we see how all of that is interrelated with each other. But before I open it up to the questions from the audience, I do have two quick questions. One of them is about the image and the front cover. I think it's very provocative. Why did you choose that image?
I'll show it. I don't know if people can see it very well, but the bottom, the image is of a man holding up a sign saying, "Stop killing our kids." And that is unfortunately what does happen. Individuals die, and the sign draws attention to that horrific loss of life. And the more surprisingly high number of individuals are shot by the police every year in the United States. And that's unfortunate. I think the police involved in those shootings think it's an unfortunate number, as well as many other citizens. But what I liked about the image is that the police, I'll hold it back up again. You can see the police officers look like they're listening, right? They look like they're engaged with this individual. They're not pepper spraying and hosing down and clubbing. And that's an optimistic, I think, view of what we hope will happen, that people will draw attention to and get officers engaged in conversations about police misbehavior. The sociologist Tony Chang did a study on Chicago police meetings recently, where he went and observed what happened in the meetings by looking at the notes and things like that. And he left with this very depressing observation that in many of the meetings, the great majority of the meetings actually, the police did not engage with citizens when they complained about misbehavior. They were there, but that was it. They were there in body, not in spirit, and were not engaged with the citizens and residents when they made complaints, and in particular complaints about misconduct. And we have to change that. We have to move from a model that has officers on one side of a protest and protesters on the other, in which there's a line between them that easily breaks and police resort to force. We need to have a model that is much more engaging. And so that's the optimistic view of the picture, even though it is about this horrific loss of life.
When I asked the question, I was not thinking of the optimistic view of the picture, but that definitely brings some optimism. One last question before I open it up to the audience is, much of your book focuses on the past. What are the implications of it for the future? What can we learn?
Yeah, so I think, there's a lot of the hubbub about critical race theory I find fascinating, because it wants to deny the role of history. And yet much of, I think, for example, in the United States, gun policy is revolved around discussion of what were the framers of the Constitution thinking about when they wrote the Second Amendment. That history matters very much in the United States in terms of a conversation about guns and gun regulation. Well, I think our book says that, yes, this torture occurred, in the last century, but yet, as we see from work from my colleague Frank Edwards, for example, police use of force still continues at unacceptable levels and in horrific ways, as in the shooting of Laquan McDonald. James Baldwin, who we refer to frequently in the book, said, the past is not the past. It's something we carry with us, and it influences how we experience the world today, whether it be the structural configurations we find ourselves in. People live in segregated neighborhoods in Chicago because of a history of redlining and residential covenants and segregation practices. Lawrence Ralph, who I've referred to a couple of times, spent time in Chicago neighborhoods asking people about their relationships with the police, and he found that people would refer to the person at the heart of this torture scandal, John Burge. They would talk about contemporary experiences of violence at the hands of the police as being burged. This is individuals who never had any direct experience with John Burge, who may not have been even born when Burge was responsible for that torture, but yet it's influenced the cultural narrative that persists in those communities. And that's deeply steeped in the history of police relationships in Chicago. So you have to be responsive to the history and the very local history, as well as more state and national things that have occurred.
Perfect. So we have some questions that have come in through the chat, and also that people submitted before. As a Newark native, I have to start with the question that asks about Newark. So I'm a little biased there. So what are the similarities and differences of Newark and Chicago during the 1970s to the 1990s?
And that's a question, Jesse, that I'm going to ask you to start. What do you think about? Because as a Newark resident, you have some sense of what Newark was like in the 1990s, perhaps, either from
yes, I do.
Earlier, from talking with your parents and friends. You have to remember, I've only been in New Jersey for a year and a half. And so much of this is new to me. And I've been participating in some of the local community organization meetings about the city. And so I know some things, but I'd like to hear what you think.
You know, I wasn't expecting that question to be flipped on me. So I grew up in Newark. I grew up right up the hill from a new community up the hill from Market Street, Broaden Market. And I feel like my experience to go to grad school, I've lived in two worlds, right? So when I grew up living in public housing up the street, I did experience a lot of that legal cynicism. I saw, living in public housing, I did see some things growing up of people getting roughed up, everybody. And I always saw the police as the bad guy, right? I didn't have any trust in them. The joke was like, if you want, the police to come, you need to tell them somebody got shot, because if it's just like something minor, they're not going to show up. So there was not a lot of respect there for the police for me growing up. So I do see some of the parallels in terms of what you're describing in the book of things that I saw growing up during the height of the crack epidemic in the 80s and 90s, living in public housing in Newark. But interesting in what I say that I lived in two worlds. When I went to grad school, and I went to college and I was at Rutgers. I did all my degrees in Rutgers, Newark. I had the opportunity to work in various research projects with the police in Newark and the police in other places in New Jersey. And during my work as a research assistant during my time, I saw a completely different side from what I was used to growing up as a civilian. I saw, I had the privilege of working with the homicide unit, and I saw those guys work tirelessly to solve murders and to bring justice and care about the people. And I saw that human element. So I feel like I've seen both sides. I've seen both of the spectrum of policing in Newark, from thinking they were the enemies to then making lifelong friends with some of them. I think there's definitely a lot of parallels between the book and what we were seeing in Newark in terms of culture. There's always bad apples and rotten apples in places. And sometimes, within the history of Newark, there have been people that haven't done such a great job. I must say that from a distance now, looking at what's going on now with the police department and looking at the mayor and his efforts, I'm very impressed, and I am hopeful that they have learned from the past and the history of the race riots and the things that happened in the 60s that marked the city, and that the city's finally moving past that. So that's.
I have to say, all the meetings that I've been at, and I've been at some virtually and some in person, I've been very impressed with the Newark police and the new municipal government in terms of their recognition that policing is so central to life in urban communities and in rural communities. But that we have to develop those relationships between officers and the community. I was at a call today, and it was wonderful to see the interaction between the street team and the police officers and other people in the community engaging in a conversation about what's the problems, what are we going to do about them, how do we work together to address these issues. And it's so refreshing. I had before I left, I came here from California, and just before I left California, I was involved in a project that spent time interviewing people in the sex industry about their relationship with the police. And one of the saddest interviews that I did, one of the people I had said, so, if you saw somebody being assaulted, would you call the police? And the person said, oh no, I wouldn't call the police because I'd be worried that the person would get killed by the police. And I said, that's the worst possible way we can structure our police relationships, where we don't call them because they think they will do bad things. And because we can see in Newark, the police are doing great things. And I think that's true in many municipalities, that there are good practices in place that are bringing community and police together.
Yes, yeah. And I think a lot of the things we could attribute now to the new leadership, at least in the last 15 years in the Newark police, there's definitely been shifts, but there's more questions. I want to get to another question. This one talking about the police, the question that came in says, if you can put yourself in the shoes of a police officer, what will you do to strengthen the relationship between law enforcement and the community, especially with minorities and the many different races and cultures that are part of the demographics in the United States, specifically New Jersey?
So I've never been in that situation. And so it's a little awkward for me to speak about what I would do as a police officer. I think policing, so I'll back up a bit and say, so my father was a firefighter. And so we would talk about what it's like to be a firefighter. And he would say, a lot of the time you spend waiting for things to happen, and fires don't happen all the time, but yet we have to wait for them to happen. And so we can sometimes use that time constructively, but sometimes it's just very tedious and boring. And I think being a police officer is very much like that. You have a lot of very routine work that's probably not very interesting, but it's part of the job and you have to do it. And yet then there are these moments of very intense, very fast paced, where you have to make decisions without time for reflection. And like many of us, we think, oh, I should have done that, but I didn't, because in the moment I just made a decision. And I assume that that's the case for many police officers. So rather than thinking about what I would do as an individual police officer, I think I'm more comfortable thinking about what I would do in terms of structuring policing in communities. And I think, we have a good bit of research, a body of research that suggests that, spending time with people in the community in non-crisis moments can do a lot for making people feel more comfortable about interacting with the police. There's a local officer, I'm going to blank on his title, so I don't want to say the title, but his last name was Peppers, who was doing all of these wonderful things in communities in Newark, having get-togethers where people would come and there would be food and there would be communications from various social service agencies. At one point, they were giving haircuts. And I think all of these types of interactions in which people interact with police not around a crisis situation help a lot in terms of your feeling that you can contact officers when you have problems. And my father emphasized how important it was as a firefighter to have relationships with people in your communities, because you needed them. Although you think about firefighters, why would you need people in the communities? Well, you need them to help you do your job. If they're not letting your trucks pass, if they're not clearing the way when you're trying to fight a fire, you can't fight a fire. So you need so much support from the community. And I think that's a key part of doing good police work. I think another thing, and this might be somewhat controversial, is I think the police have to they have to demand more from their police unions. Before going to graduate school, I taught public school. And one of the frustrations that you have as a teacher is that people want you to do a whole bunch of things. They want you to be a teacher, a guidance counselor, a family problem solver. And the teaching unions, at least where I taught school, were very good at saying, no, this is what teaching involves. This is what teachers are responsible for in the classroom. You want schools to do those other things? Well, we need to hire professionals to do those other things. Do you think there should be a counselor in school? We need to hire someone who is a counselor, you see? And yet, I think police unions have not done that well in terms of saying, protecting police and saying, this is what policing involves. These other things aren't, and we shouldn't be continually expecting the police to do that. The researcher, Christopher Herring, did some work in San Francisco talking about the policing of the homeless, for example. And in his interviews with the police, found that many of them find it a very poor use of their time to continually police the homeless. They think there are probably other people who could much better serve that population. We don't have the skills, and it's taking us away from the activities that we really should be engaged in. And I see that as clearly something that the police union should do a better job at articulating. What are the things that police should be concentrating their time on? And how do we incorporate other professionals who can deal with some of the things that are increasingly they get required or expected to do?
Thank you. We don't have a lot of time. There are a lot of questions. I'm going to try to go through them. And I apologize in advance if I don't get to your questions. Hopefully the organizers could look at them and then send responses or send them to Bill. But this question, thoughts about militarism and imperialism in policing. Many of the Rutgers crew's techniques were adopted from counterinsurgency torture in Vietnam. How do you think about these links in terms of racism, militarism, empire, and dehumanization?
That's a very good question. And the person is right. There's pretty clear evidence that some of the techniques that were used in Vietnam. And it's horrific. And it's a very sad part of our history. And there is good body of research, showing the increased link between military training, military forces, military equipment, and policing. And it's not clear that has led to good outcomes, whether it be police over militarizing in terms of the equipment that they have, in terms of making a more military, in terms of the organization rather than one that's more community-based. I don't know what the answer is, unfortunately. The link between the federal government and state and municipal government in terms of police funding over the last 20 years has created an incentive for police departments to acquire more military equipment. The United States has a gun problem. There's no way not to say that. There are just way too many guns here. And I understand police officers wanting to protect themselves from the guns that other people have, but yet we need to find a better solution that addresses how do we reduce the amount of guns without it involving increased militarization of the police. And I'm sorry, I don't have an answer.
Yeah, that could be another talk in itself. And then you talked about a little bit about the gun problem, and I'm like, that could also be a talk in itself. We're giving them ideas for future talks. But moving on, it's not my question, it's the person's question is, to what extent do you see procedural justice as being able to change the social effects of atrocities committed by police departments, including police torture in Chicago, and create community trust in law enforcement?
That's a good question, because we do talk about procedural justice a good bit in the book. And for those who aren't familiar, procedural justice is Tom Tyler's research on showing that if police treat people better in their interactions, people feel better about the outcome, even when it's not an outcome they might desire. So that if they get a ticket, for example, that's usually not an outcome that anyone wants. But if they feel that the police were respectful and listened to them, they feel better about the interactions. And we don't deny that procedural justice matters. I think it just makes sense that if you treat people nicely, they're going to feel better about the interaction. But we argue that legal cynicism is the much more pressing concern. That if you have people who do not think the police are viable as an institution, who mistrust them, who are suspicious of them, who have a history of mistreatment by them, the interactions with one individual officer, which might be good and have a procedural justice fairness element to them, can't change all of that. That legal cynicism is much more systematic, and it's grounded in a long history. And those are places where we think you also have to direct change. Yes, we should do things that will increase the likelihood that an individual will have a good interaction with an officer, regardless of the outcome that they're going to have, and that they feel good about it and they feel they were treated fairly and just. But we have to do something about why do people disproportionately in marginalized, poor, racially segregated communities, why do they see the police in such a negative view? And it is because of a history of mistreatment that we have to figure out ways of addressing.
So along those lines, how would you suggest we revert back that legal cynicism?
Well, I think that Newark is a good example of trying to do that, where we're saying, okay, we're going to have these community forums where we have, you think about people coming together from community organizations and from the Department of the Police and from the mayor's office saying, yes, we're all involved in this conversation. But also think about street outreach teams, which are saying, okay, you need us. We're not police officers, but you need us to help to deal with problems in the community. So that recognition of bringing in others to help. Many police forces in other parts of the world are bringing in counselors, social workers who accompany them when they go out, because they're saying that's what you can do better than us. So I think it's that recognition of what the police can do well and bringing in others who can do the other things that they can do better. And that level of community engagement that then tries to address or increase, tries to increase the confidence that individuals may have with the police as an organization. And then structurally, we have to do things. We have to continue to do things to undo 100 years and plus of racial segregation and mistreatment.
I agree wholeheartedly. Moving on to another question. I'm trying to get more questions in the next 4 minutes. So have a question here. I have read that John Burge was held criminally responsible for perjury in relationship to the torture cases. But were there any other members of his midnight crew penalized in any way?
So I believe that there were other officers. So the person makes a good point that John Burge was eventually taken to trial, but it was for perjury. He was never charged with the torture. I believe that some of the fellow officers received reprimands and lost days of pay. I do not know if anybody else was ever fired for the use of torture or if that was the extent. But there were, as far as I know, there were no other officers. And Burge was never charged with the criminal offense in terms of the use of torture.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one last question. And I'm going to paraphrase this because it's divided into 3 questions. So has there been some focus and study into police behaviors and attitudes about people of color aside from just regular policing tactics? And then the person goes on to comment, I believe police law enforcement treatment of people of color should not just be limited to their training and lack thereof. A large part has to do with how they view people of color and attitudes in general. So do you know of any research on attitudes in general?
Yeah, there is, and I'm not an expert in this area, but there is a good body of research in terms of both interviews and surveys of police, as well as ethnographies in which people do ride around with police. And as you know, what you had said earlier, there is some cultural aspects to policing which are more broadly shared, but yet it varies by municipalities. What we do see is that in general, police are more suspicious of others. They often have neighborhood narratives that says that, you know, this is a bad neighborhood, and that those interpretations or those frames are often connected to the demographic attributes of neighborhoods. They're more likely to see neighborhoods as problematic, that are poor, that are racial minority neighborhoods that they believe have high crime rates, although sometimes that information is inaccurate. The police, like many of us, when we hear about crimes in a particular location, will generalize from that location to the whole neighborhood or the whole community. And there's good evidence that crimes do disproportionately occur in certain locations, but those locations are often very small, and they're influenced by a particular set of, as you know from your research, and we know from the research here by Joel Kaplan and Les Kennedy, that there's a bunch of situational attributes, characteristics of the built environment that are increase the likelihood of a criminal event occurring, and that we can change those. So that it's less about who's in the neighborhoods than it's about sometimes the structural and geographical conditions of those neighborhoods.
I'm going to sneak in one last question. You have 30 seconds to answer this. Thoughts on the truth and reconciliation efforts for torture victims?
Yes, it's wonderful that it's happening in Chicago, and I encourage people who are interested in the topic to go to the internet and search what's been done. It's taken years. It was part of Rahm Emanuel's, I think, last acts trying to atone for the things that had happened in Chicago. So yes, there's lots to be done. We're seeing exonerations for individuals who were tortured. One of the Wilson brothers, who's at the center of the book, was recently exonerated. And so yes, there's good stuff being done. So please check it out.
Well, I am going to wrap it up. It's 4:29. We have 1 minute, so I will invite Alexandra back to bring it to wrap the session up. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jesse. Thanks to everyone for the questions. They were great.
Dean McCarthy and Dr. Pizarro, on behalf of the Rutgers University Alumni Association, we'd like to thank you for this powerful and insightful conversation and for sharing your time, wisdom, and expertise this evening. We'd like to thank all of the attendees for joining us today, and we hope to see you soon.